I worked just shy of 40 years, but my pension still wasn't going to be enough for us. So when he called out of the blue, offering a free pension review, I was all ears. He spoke professionally about investments. He seemed a really decent guy. Just shy of 40 years pension. He took all of it.
Next up, this week marks the 2-year anniversary of Brexit. But how successful has it been? Joining us now is Lord Frost, who was Chief Negotiator of Task Force Europe from January 2020 until his resignation in December last year, and the journalist Ed West, who runs the Substack Wrong Side of History.
Lord Frost, in the Spectator this week, Ross Clark calls Brexit the abandoned revolution. He says that not much has changed in the country since we left the European Union. And he concludes by saying, fewer Eastern Europeans and no tampon tax doesn't seem quite enough to justify the whole agonising business. What did you make of Ross's argument?
Well, I sort of sympathise in that I don't think we've got going fast enough on all the things that we need to do. I think he probably overstates it slightly, to be honest. I think there's a little bit more to the government's credit than he gives. Things like the ARIA Research Agency, for example, is a big new thing of, part of being science superpower. But there's no doubt, as I suggested when I left government, that we, have some concerns about the direction of travel, and we're not getting on with things as quickly as we should be.
So in terms of that direction of travel then, what do you see as being the key points which is going in the wrong direction?
So I think there are two things, really. We know, all history tells us, I think, that democratic nation-states are the best way of organising life and political debate and making things happen. So we need to rebuild our own nation-state after 50 years of EU membership, and we need to boost our own prosperity and wealth. And so we need to do things that rebuild the nation and get us going on economic reform, on change, on boosting wealth, on increasing growth in a way that we haven't so far. So, I would say we should certainly not be increasing taxes, for example. We should be cutting them. We should be continuing the super deduction for capital allowances, that sort of thing. We should also stop doing some other stuff that we don't need to do, banning foie gras or whatever. Legislative time for a government is very precious, and I don't think one should waste it on side issues. So those are some of the things that we should definitely not be doing, and there are certainly things we should be doing.
Ed, in December 2020, you wrote a piece for Unheard in which you said that whilst you were once a fervent Eurosceptic, you had come to believe that leaving was in fact a terrible blunder. Just over a year on, do you still feel that way?
I change my mind about this every 15 minutes, pretty much. I was very early, quite in two minds about it. I remember a speech about 3 weeks before the actual results. But there was an event for Leave supporters at Millbank Tower, and Boris was the lead speaker, and he gave this talk about sort of the City of London resurrecting the city, and after Brexit was done, this would be a further renaissance of this great globalised city. I remember at the time thinking this is really the opposite of what a lot of Leave voters want. They want to put the brakes on globalisation. They don't want accelerated globalisation. I thought there was such a contradiction between what a lot of Leavers want. After leaving the EU, it would end in tears. In particular, Ross does mention this in the article, the immigration was a huge part of it, and it was such a massive issue that people felt, and I think correctly, that their wages were being driven down by the sheer amount of migration since 1997. And, we didn't even know how many migrants there were in the EU, far more than we thought we had, which just shows, how disastrous it was. And if that is not going to be reduced in the next years, then I think, the huge costs of Brexit are going to be really not worth it at all. Especially the latest ONS figures suggest that, migration is still going to be at sort of 200,000. Obviously COVID has put a sort of spanner in the works, but I suspect it will be back to... And if you just substitute migration from Poland or Romania for migration from India or other places, then, to me, that seems an absurd reason to go through all the hassle of leaving the EU.
So I think people connect things that shouldn't be connected. I don't see why, if you believe in Britain as a country and you want to control immigration, I agree with you on the numbers there. I don't see why, if you want to do those things, that necessarily makes you a statist and a socialist. And similarly, why, if you're a globalist and believe in free markets and global investment, that necessarily means you must be against Brexit. And these things get sort of linked, I think, in a way that's not really justifiable. I think the proposition that our voters got behind in December 2019 was rebuild the nation state and make it prosperous again. And making it prosperous means free markets and liberal market economics.
I mean, one of my crank beliefs among many is that I think it could be possible that left and right realign on Europe, because there's no reason why I can see already a lot of social liberals are thinking, well, actually Brexit is sort of delivering the sort of society we want. While if you're a Brexit voter, you might actually have more kind of, like UKIP supporters do have kind of basically social democratic views on the economy, much more in line with Germany or France than with the United States. So it's possible, Brexit can be a socially liberal internationally thing, and I think that's what Brexit voters don't want.
Lord Frost, how much do you think the pandemic has limited what we've been able to do with Brexit?
It obviously has limited things a bit. It's taken a huge amount, rightly, of internal government attention, ministerial time, and so on, and so it should have. I don't think, on its own, it necessarily would have stopped us, doing the right things economically. I don't buy the connection between dealing with the pandemic and tax rises, for example. I think the right thing is to take those costs onto debt and focus on keeping taxes low and growing the economy. And I think it would still have been possible to push forward some things like the procurement bill, which seems to have got held up in the background while this was going on. So obviously it's been a very significant difficulty and problem for the government and for the country, but I still don't think it stops setting the right direction of travel.
And Lord Frost, in Ross's piece, he also says that the most damaging thing, aside from a lack of action as he sees it, is that the Prime Minister hasn't even really signalled his future intentions with newfound Brexit freedoms. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think only up to a point. I think actually the Prime Minister has been very good in setting a vision for how he wants the country to be, and I think it's one that a lot of people can get behind. It's just that we haven't willed the means that take us to that end. And a lot of, government is about making choices, and you need a philosophy that enables you to choose one thing rather than another to get to the objective you want to get to. And I think that's when I talk about concerns about the direction of travel, it's not so much the ultimate goal is, do I believe we're going to get there with the things we're currently doing? And no, I'm a bit doubtful.
Ed, there was an interesting point in your piece, which was that you thought that the antagonism of Brexit was not actually necessarily towards other Europeans, but towards the British people. Do you think that is starting to subside? Do you think there's a kind of slightly more peaceful moment now, or is it still quite touchy?
I think I read the other day that Remain and Leave identities amongst people are still quite strong, stronger than political identification. So I think those tribes will still exist, but to some extent those political tribes have basically become, the Conservative and the Labour Party. So there'd been Brexit accelerated the sort of realignment in politics, which was going to happen anyway, but now it's happened more clearly. The problem that Boris Johnson seems to have now, he's alienating many of his new voters, but they've basically lost a huge swathe of the sort of public, especially the younger voters, who I think will never vote for them because of Brexit. I think also, a lot, referring to the previous question, a lot of the problem is that because Brexit is still such a sort of new idea, it's going to be shaped by the personalities of whoever basically starts it. And Boris Johnson doesn't really have a vision in that sense. I think I sort of know what Boris Johnson believes in, but he doesn't have this kind of vision of sort of nation building, which is almost what we could. And it could have actually been Jeremy Corbyn. His Brexit, he would have had the freedom to sort of shape Brexit as he liked, which I'm sure not many of us would have been too happy about. So I think it might depend on who comes after Boris Johnson, and if there is someone who has more of a sort of vision of what he wants.
In terms of then a vision for the future, Lord Frost, we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, and this morning you retweeted Alistair Heath's Telegraph column and agreed with the statement that the government needs to get rid of the neo-socialists, green fanatics and pro-woke crowd. Who are they?
I thought you might ask me that. I think the answer is they know who they are. I do think it's important that the team around the Prime Minister share the objectives of the people who elected the government. And I'm not always convinced that's always been the case. I don't want to kind of, exaggerate it, but I do think it's important that people understand what drove the election result and stay in touch with the country and the voters. And I'm not sure we've always done that, and I think it's really important.
Just to finish on, you made the point that Westminster politicians had often used the EU as an excuse to avoid doing things that they didn't really want to. Do you think what we're seeing now is British politicians getting used to having to sort of take more responsibility for their own decisions?
Well, I should hope so. I mean, unfortunately, the C word has sort of slightly put a spanner in the works until now. There hasn't. I mean, there are certain things that Europe stopped a Conservative government doing. If it wants to reform, I mean, the Conservatives always have the problem, but basically the system, the people who run the system, are against them, or there's that perception. It's called the blob, or whatever, and that prevents them sort of fully implementing Conservative like a social policy. But not all of that was the Europe, and then there was lots of stuff they could sort of take responsibility for themselves. I have to be honest, I've sort of yet to see an example of them sort of doing that. But I mean, maybe I'm just.
No, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think one of the effects of being in the EU 50 years is that it sort of sapped a bit of the national will to get things done, even in areas which were not EU competence, where we could always have done things ourselves. We've kind of looked to others to help solve the problem rather than getting on with it.
Do you think it also means that people who want to run the world don't go into the sort of British institutions because they think nothing really gets done? The place to go is.
I think that has been more an effect elsewhere in Europe
right.
than here. It was a bit of an effect here. I think as people saw which way the wind was blowing a bit in the last 10 years or so, the people focused back down on the UK. And I do think it is really important that we spend a lot of time debating the economics of Brexit and still do, but for me fundamentally it's about democracy. It's about it being a good thing for a country that it can decide things for itself in its own institutions and argue them out and come to decisions that people can live with. And if you outsource your decision making, you don't get that, and in the end it's bad for the national life. And I think it's really good that we're coming back to some really tough and difficult arguments about philosophy and where we want to go as a country. That's right, that's politics, and that's people like me who've got to win those arguments now.
Lord Frost and Ed, thank you very much indeed.